According to G2.com, which is an online portal that rates CRM systems, there are 772 of them on the market. That's more than the total number of goals Robert Lewandowski has scored in his entire career, or the number of phone calls Czesław Michniewicz has made to his friend. How do you find your way in all this? That's what we're going to talk about today. If you're approaching the implementation of a CRM system for the first time because you don't have one yet, or if you're considering switching your current CRM system, today I'll try to guide you through it in just a few, literally 7 steps. I won't say they're simple steps because it's actually quite a complex process, but in 7 steps I'll define what this process should look like from start to finish. From the very beginning, meaning from the first step, which in my opinion should be defining and gathering the needs among stakeholders. Stakeholders such as sales, that is salespeople, sales management and so on, because they will be the main users of this system, so they should define their needs. Of course, there's also marketing, finance, possibly logistics departments, complaints departments, customer service, customer success, and so on, even technology teams, and of course the management board, which may also have its own needs for a system of this kind. And now, how do we define what is important to us, and how do we reconcile all these interests? Because we know very well that sometimes these needs can be mutually exclusive, they can be very diverse, and yet we would like to have a clear document that shows us what we really need from this system and how to build these requirements so that we can go to the market and ask for a specific solution. One of the methods that can definitely be helpful here is the so-called Moscow W method. Moscow W is a method that originated at Oracle in the 1990s and was later more widely adopted in agile methodologies for project management. However, it also works very well when specifying a tool and identifying the critical needs for our business that a given tool should fulfill. Moscow is an acronym for must have, should have, could have, and won't have. A table that we create for Moscow W, by the way, you'll find a downloadable version of such a table in the link below this video, can be useful not only for defining product requirements, but it can also be very helpful if you're building an MVP of a product. If you want to develop a certain technology, the Moscow W methodology is very useful. I'm providing you with a ready-made table that you can use to define, for example, requirements for a CRM system. So must have means what it absolutely has to have. Should have is what it should have, could have is what it could have, and won't have is what we actually don't need at this stage. This way we create a table of functionalities, possible integrations, and so on. That is, the things we set in a given section, for example, must have. Obviously things like pipeline management and lead management are must-haves, but for example, integration with an ERP system might fall under could have, because at this stage it's not important for us, or it might not be important at all. So in this particular way, we can clearly define our specific needs to a certain extent, allowing for a more comprehensive understanding. And here we come to the second point, which is that with these requirements, we can go to the market. As I mentioned, according to the G2.com portal, there are a multitude of these solutions on the market. So how do we find the solution that will be right for us? First of all, we look for solutions that are visible on the market, because we also want to work with vendors who are present, who can support the solution, and who can implement it. And here, when it comes to choosing a solution, in my opinion, the testing phase, the so-called proof of concept, is very important. What is a proof of concept? A proof of concept is demonstrating that the tool is actually capable of doing something. Imagine you have a process that starts here and ends here, from A to Z. A sequence of actions has to take place in our system, maybe send some notifications, maybe send some integration parameter, and we want the company providing the solution for us to build such a simple process. This is important because it allows us to assess first how reliable and quick the provider is, and second, not only whether the tool meets our requirements, which is a very important parameter, but above all, whether it is agile and easy to adopt. This is an issue we'll talk about in a moment. However, the alignment of the requirements that our system creates, or rather the requirements we have set for the system, which would be a better way to put it. That's one thing, but the other is the speed of adoption, how quickly we are able to implement processes on the platform, integrate them, modify them, and adapt them to current business needs. This is very important because if we buy a solution based only on a comparison table, every provider will tell you, of course, that their solution is great at integration, customization, and editing forms. But until we check this ourselves and compare it with other solutions, it will be hard to assess it just based on such a table. So, the product specification that the provider can fill out for you is one thing, but another is actually testing, feeling, and experiencing the product yourself. And this is very important. Processes versus solution? Exactly. Often the question arises here about what we should do first. Should we first meticulously build the essential processes? That's precisely what most experienced experts in these types of systems consistently say. Or should we first choose a tool and then adapt the processes to it? Of course, it seems quite logical that the processes should come first, since they are what we actually have implemented. They drive the company, so they should be built first. And then we apply them to the platform as the system we ultimately want to implement. And generally that makes sense. This kind of approach is the right one. However, we have to remember one very important thing. I've been working in IT systems for 15 years and I've seen a lot, and we like to say that paper is very patient. That is, the consultants we hire can spend weeks or even months mapping out our processes. Paper will accept anything. Paper will take any process we draw out because a sheet of paper and a pencil have no limits. The only limit is really our imagination. Unfortunately, systems do have such limits, and we need to be aware of that. That is, once we have these processes mapped out, we should check to what extent they can be implemented in the system. And ideally, we would have already chosen that system beforehand, and the company writing these processes would be able to write them in such a way that they work seamlessly on that system. Why am I mentioning this? Because not every company. Imagine that your total budget for implementing a CRM is 500x, including the process work in sales. 200x goes toward process work and you're left with 300x for the CRM system itself. And what will happen? What if the only system capable of handling these processes costs 2000x? Then we have a problem. That's why I advocate for a common sense approach. Because if a well-implemented process brings you an annual gain of 100,000 zlotys, but maintaining it on the platform costs 300,000 zlotys, then what's the point? I once heard a very good saying, processes are made for the company, not the company for the processes. So if you see that a process designed for you by a consulting company is difficult to maintain on the platform itself, then let's just change it. Let's change it so that it brings us business value, because business is about making money, not about conservatively maintaining the processes we've designed. To wrap up this topic, I'll repeat once again, processes are meant to serve the company, not the company the processes. That's the most important thing. Estimating the cost of the solution. I've already started talking about these X's, 500x, 1000x, 2000x. How much could this cost? And here, very often in IT projects, and this will be the fourth point, which serves to estimate the costs of such a solution. This is another thing I want to share with you via a link, and it's called a TCO form, which will help you calculate the TCO. What is TCO? TCO stands for total cost of ownership, meaning the overall cost of not just purchasing but owning something. Why? Because most companies make the mistake of calculating it like this. The processes will cost 200x, which someone has to design, since you have to somehow map them onto the platform later. 200x is the cost of the processes. The cost of the system is 300x. The cost of support in the first year is 100x. And that's usually where the calculation ends for most clients I've met over 15 years of delivering IT solutions. And that's a fundamental mistake, because those aren't the only costs. In fact, this might only make up 50% of the actual costs we'll incur for the system, or maybe even less. Why? Because TCO, or total cost of ownership for CRM type systems, is usually, though not always, calculated over a 5-year horizon. That means we should calculate how much this system will cost us over 5 years. And we don't just count the processes, implementation, licenses, and some maintenance in the first year. We should also calculate how much the so-called AMS, or annual maintenance support, will cost us. This is yearly access to support and updates for all 5 years going forward. Ask the provider whether inflation will be taken into account and whether these prices might increase. If they might, then ideally we should either get a guarantee from the provider, or if the provider is unable to give us such a guarantee, which often happens. It would be great if we could sign a 5-year contract and lock in that price, so we can be sure that the prices won't go up. Another thing is the costs that no one ever counts, such as training costs, which have to be borne both by the administrative team that will manage the system and by the team that actually uses the system, that is, our end users, the recipients of the processes, the users of the system like salespeople and sales managers, who also need to be trained, albeit at a different level. Integrations. If we want to integrate with any solution whatsoever, and this is very important because we can estimate it at the beginning, for example, by using a proof of concept, we are able to roughly scope it out, meaning we can assess the range, but also the time consumption of such an integration project, meaning the implementation of a new integration, for example. We should consider how many such integrations we might go through over the next 5 years, because new systems and new needs will keep emerging. Of course, it's not that simple because business moves very quickly these days, but we should keep this in mind. Other things that may come up include the involvement of our own teams. That is, if consultants come in to do something for us, or implementation specialists are installing a system and it takes a lot of time, then our people who are involved in this implementation in this system are not doing their regular work that they would normally be doing. This means that this too is a cost. I know that few companies calculate it this way, but unfortunately, that's how it is. If we think about those 5 years, we should really take into account a lot of things, which are hard for me to list off the top of my head. So I recommend once again, under this video, you'll find a link where you can access these two things: the Moscov method, which you can work on, and a TCO calculator for CRM solutions, which will help you calculate the real cost, that is the total cost of ownership for the next 5 years. Point 5. Ecosystem. I told you that integrations can be very expensive. It's not the case that a CRM usually operates in isolation from the entire ecosystem of products that an organization has. Because if you look at any company today, you'll see that the company actually forms a kind of constellation in which there are many different products that serve the interests of various groups and of course deliver some real value, whether smaller or greater. And we fit the CRM into this constellation of products. And unfortunately or fortunately, because it brings us a lot of value, we have to integrate it with various other products. For example, we have a marketing automation system that feeds us leads, nurtures those leads, and when it determines they are qualified, it puts them into our lead funnel. We might also have, on the completely opposite end of the entire process, some kind of integration. For example, integration with an ERP system, with an accounting system that checks warehouse stock, verifies whether an invoice has been paid, and displays this information to the salespeople. We can also have BI systems. All of this brings tremendous value, but it creates one big problem, namely costs. The costs of maintaining these types of integrations are enormous, and they are rarely taken into account when starting a new project. However, after a while you'll see that it will be great to integrate this, that, and something else as well. And after a few months, it turns out that there are so many integrations and so many connections between systems, and after all, these integrations require ongoing maintenance. What does that mean? It means that if the third, fourth, fifth, or sixth product undergoes regular updates, and all of them have to go through such updates, the API might change or something else might change. The API is an interface used for integrating solutions. The database structure might change, or a whole range of other things could change, all of which would affect the integration. So if we have several of these integrations, we have to maintain them continuously, and of course that comes with costs, significant ones, because maintaining these kinds of solutions usually requires developer work. We need to have people who know this, who built it, or we need to have well-prepared documentation, and in that case maintaining it becomes even more expensive. And so on, and so on, and so on. We don't think about this, but that's why I said that TCO can be very imprecise if you only consider the entry barrier. Because the deeper we go into integrating such systems, the higher these costs simply become. How can this be solved? There are two approaches. That is, first, you can look for systems that are simply easy to integrate and have a lot of connectors ready to connect to other products, and then, because not every product integrates in the same way, you need to know that. That is, the structure of the systems determines whether they are flexible, whether they are easy to integrate, whether the API documentation is well done, and so on. So to make things easier, let's look for products that are, first of all, flexible. We could probably do another podcast just about that, and maybe we will someday. Secondly, products that have ready-made connectors and are able, at least on a basic level, to integrate with the most popular products on the market. And thirdly, in my opinion, a very interesting approach is the one used by Zoho. Today, for the first time, that name has to come up. This is about buying so-called ecosystems, meaning providers who have a lot of solutions that are integrated with each other out of the box. Well, we don't have to look far. An example of such a solution is Microsoft, which is integrated out of the box with a whole range of different products. In my opinion, the worst choice is typically standalone products, meaning a single manufacturer who only makes one product. It's just an ordinary CRM, unless it's a really big product like Salesforce and you want to approach a truly large implementation. But even Salesforce, despite being a single name and everyone thinking it's just one product, is actually an extensive platform that contains a lot of features that elsewhere would be considered part of a larger ecosystem. Therefore, purchasing an ecosystem, that is a CRM, which out of the box, without any additional integrations or development, is integrated with a whole range of different products from the same family, and these integrations are maintained by the vendor, meaning the provider of this solution, is a very cost-effective approach. You will simply save a lot of money over those 5 years we talked about, not only on integrating, but also on the ongoing maintenance of those integrations. We've talked a bit about the solution, so now let's discuss the providers for a moment. How do you choose a solution provider? I've already touched on this a bit. However, in my opinion, it's best to choose reliable providers above all. What does a reliable provider mean? It's one that has redundancy. That's an IT term meaning excess capacity or backup. If we choose a solution that has only one integrator or provider in Poland, this can create a certain problem because there is no competition on the market that we could turn to. Unless we find someone abroad, but we know that it's always better to work with companies that are simply Polish. And there's always a lower barrier, including in terms of price, because we know that services abroad can be more expensive. So let's look for solutions that have at least 2 providers on the market, or that have a broad range of, for example, freelancers, people who are already skilled in a given technology, and there are many of them on the market, so they will always be able to help us. This is important from the perspective of business continuity, because what will happen if our regular provider simply stops operating, or we have a falling out with them, decide we don't like them anymore, and want to work with someone else? We need to have that someone else as a backup. That's the first thing we should pay attention to. The second thing is process know-how. That's what I mentioned earlier, because there are several approaches. As we discussed before, we can find a company that only does consulting, which will create processes for us that we then implement on the platform or in a given solution. However, the problem is that this company usually doesn't know the platform. It's great to find a solution or provider that integrates all of this, meaning they can build sales processes for us with the specific tool in mind that they'll be implementing them on. This always saves us from friction. Of course, this approach also has its downsides because we become dependent on a single provider and a single source of know-how. However, it's worth thinking more deeply and analyzing also in the context of Moscow W what exactly we need. Is it better to choose a provider who will deliver everything for us end to end? But in that case, in my opinion, we should start by looking for a CRM type solution, and then once we've chosen a specific company, look for a particular provider who not only knows that solution, can integrate it, implement it and customize it, but can also provide us with project know-how and process know-how to structure our sales and our internal processes within the organization. Not just sales, but those that are thoroughly RevOps related. I'll probably tell you more about RevOps in one of the upcoming podcasts as well, so that we can smoothly map them onto the platform. This is something I won't repeat myself about, but as we said, even if someone very patiently maps out the processes for us and they all make sense on paper, implementing them in the system can turn out to be problematic. And this doesn't even stem from the system's shortcomings. Every system has its own architecture, which may mean that a certain process needs to be handled a bit differently. Of course, there are extremely flexible, very large solutions that cost enormous budgets, and then we actually burn through a lot of extra days just to meet the process requirements that someone has set for us. And that doesn't always make sense, because then another process comes up, which is also something we could talk about someday, namely streamlining processes that someone has already mapped out. So we end up processing something again that has already been done once. Case studies, that's also a really great thing. If we have suppliers, let's ask them for case studies from other implementations with other clients. Let's check whether this product has proven effective in companies that, for example, operate in our industry, or in companies of a similar size that have similar process requirements. If we review such a case study, it always brings significant value. Besides case studies, it can also be, for example, a reference call, which we very often arrange with clients. This means that one client is already using a given system, is satisfied with it, and we arrange for such clients to meet in pairs so they can simply sit down and talk. That's actually a really great thing. Of course, from the supplier's point of view, we have to be sure of what we're doing, because we leave these clients alone and they can have an honest conversation. But that's exactly the point. There's no better salesperson than a client to whom you've already sold something and who can honestly talk about the product. That's why if you're approaching a project, look for companies that are already using this product. Ask the supplier if they can connect you with someone like that, and then the decision will definitely be easier. You'll also find out if there's anything wrong with the solution, because let's be honest, every solution has its pros and cons. The last thing, which is point 7, and I feel like after watching a few videos about choosing a CRM, almost no one talks about it, is security. And I truly believe that this particular aspect, even though it's often significantly downplayed by many companies when they are making a crucial choice, is last, but it certainly shouldn't be least, because it's simply a very important and critical issue. Today, especially, we have a great number of regulatory bodies that meticulously check our full compliance with various stringent standards. Of course, not every company is subject to all standards. We have NIS2, we have DORA, which has just come into effect and mainly applies to the financial sector, but also to companies that provide services to that sector. We have GDPR, which basically applies to all of us when it comes to the security of information and personal data that we store in our marketing automation systems and our CRM type systems. This is an issue that we definitely should look into more deeply. Why? Because not all of us realize what can happen with this data. If we purchase an on-premise installation, meaning one installed at our company, which is already rare these days, because let's face it, most of the CRM market consists of cloud-based systems. First and foremost, we should ask the provider a few important questions. First, where are the data centers physically located? That is, are they located in the United States? And that's already an issue, because if data leaves the EEA, meaning the European Economic Area, it can become problematic. Are the data centers, as I mentioned, located in Europe? But do certain analytical mechanisms or integration mechanisms not cause some data to flow through other data centers? Because that also happens quite often. All compliance reports, because this could be ISO 27001, ISO 20000, as I mentioned, DORA, NES. There are really a lot of them, and especially in cloud systems, we should pay attention to security issues. Another important thing is the DPA, or Data Processing Agreement. This is an agreement on data processing. Remember that if you have your client's personal data in the system and you ask a provider, for example in South America, and you transfer support data, support logs, or you give them access to this installation, then you already have a problem, right? Because someone is processing this data in some way. So we have to be very careful about many of these aspects here. If you are a larger company, you definitely have so-called security specialists who will handle this topic. However, if not, it's a good idea to make sure the provider explains these things to you, or simply use the services of an external security consultant who will help you and tell you what to ask about. And that's all for today. If you have any additional questions, of course, ask them in the comments. Remember, I'm leaving you 2 very useful files in the description below the video, and see you in the next.